On the morning of June 12th, 1993, a man was walking along the shore of a quiet lake in Scandia, Minnesota, when he saw something pale bobbing in the shallow water near the reeds. At first, he thought it was a mannequin head. Someone's idea of a sick joke, maybe, tossed into the lake by teenagers. He almost kept walking. He didn't. What he found floating in Bone Lake that morning was a human head, cleanly, bluntly severed at the neck. The eyes were brown. The hair was dark, short, cut into a spiky style. Both ears had been pierced 3 times each. There was no body, no name, no missing persons report waiting to be matched. Just a face, and a silence that would last for 33 years. Welcome to Bloodline History. This is the story of the Bone Lake Jane Doe, one of the strangest, coldest, and most quietly haunting cases in Minnesota history. A woman who was found in pieces, forgotten for 3 decades, and only just recently, in the summer of 2026, given her name back. But even now, with her identity finally restored, the question that matters most is still wide open. Someone did this to her, and that someone has never been caught. Let's start at the beginning. Scandia, Minnesota is not the kind of place where anything happens. It's a small, rural township northeast of St. Paul, the kind of community where everyone knows everyone, and a stranger's face gets noticed. Bone Lake sits quietly on the edge of it, a fishing spot, the kind of water where locals take their kids on a Saturday morning. Nobody expects to find a severed head there. When investigators arrived on June 12th, they estimated the woman had been dead somewhere between 2 and 3 days. The head had been exposed to the elements for a short enough time that her features were still recognizable. Whoever had done this hadn't been dead long. Whoever had done this might still have been nearby. And then, less than 24 hours later, the case took an even darker turn. On the evening of June 13th, 1993, a second piece of her was found, not in Scandia, not anywhere near Bone Lake. 30 miles away, on the banks of the Mississippi River, just north of a place called Pig's Eye Lake in St. Paul, someone discovered a human foot, severed just above the ankle. A woman's foot, roughly a size 9. 2 remains, 2 separate bodies of water, 30 miles apart, found within a single day of each other. Investigators immediately suspected the head and the foot belonged to the same woman. It made sense. The timing, the type of injury, the era of decomposition all lined up. But in 1993, DNA testing was still in its infancy. It was expensive, it was slow, and it wasn't reliable enough to definitively link 2 separate discoveries 30 miles apart. So for a long time, all investigators could do was assume. They couldn't prove it. What they did have was a face, or at least the closest thing to one they could construct. The Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension put together a hand-drawn sketch based on the recovered skull, then followed it up with a more detailed color rendering of what she might have looked like in life. The short, dark hair, the triple ear piercings, the young, unremarkable features of a woman who could have walked past anyone on any street in America. They sent her description and her dental records to the National Crime Information Center. They circulated her face to every police department across a 5-state area. Nothing came back. No calls, no leads. Nobody recognized her. Detectives searched the area around Bone Lake with bloodhounds. Divers went into the water looking for the rest of her. They canvassed the neighborhood, going door to door, showing her sketch to every resident of a town small enough that a stranger should have stood out. One detective would later put it simply: "This is a quiet, rural place, and there weren't a lot of short-haired, heavily pierced young women wandering around Scandia in 1993. If she wasn't local, that raised an unsettling possibility. Somebody may have driven her out to that lake specifically because nobody there would know who she was." But even that theory led nowhere. No body was ever recovered. No arrest was ever made. And with no name, no missing persons report to compare her to, and no witnesses coming forward, the case did something that cases like this do when nobody is left to push them forward. It went cold. Ice cold. For 14 years, the Bone Lake Jane Doe sat in storage, a skull and a foot in an evidence room. A woman with a face but no name, waiting. In 2007, forensic technology had finally caught up. The Minnesota BCA ran new DNA testing on both sets of remains and confirmed what investigators had assumed all along. The head and the foot did belong to the same person. It was one victim, one woman. Somebody had taken her apart and scattered her across two different bodies of water in two different jurisdictions, 30 miles from each other. Confirming that the remains matched was progress. But it still didn't tell anyone who she was. And the DNA samples recovered from a head and a foot that had already spent over a decade in storage were degraded. Old, damaged, difficult to work with, using the technology of the time. Another 14 years passed. In 2021, investigators tried again, sending a sample of the remains out for advanced testing. It failed. They tried a different lab, a private DNA company out of state. That failed too. The DNA was simply too old, too compromised by nearly 30 years of time, to produce a usable genetic profile using standard forensic methods. By this point, the case had been cold for almost 3 decades. The trail that had never really existed to begin with had gone even colder. And this is usually where stories like this one end. Not with an answer, but with a file gathering dust in a records room, occasionally reopened, occasionally re-examined, never solved. But in 2022, something changed. The Ramsey County Medical Examiner's Office reached out to a non-profit organization called the DNA Doe Project, a group founded by genetic genealogists who specialize in exactly this kind of case. Cold, unidentified remains that traditional forensic DNA testing couldn't crack. Using forensic genetic genealogy, the same category of technique that had cracked cases like the Golden State Killer, they build family trees from tiny degraded genetic fragments, working backward through distant cousins and ancestry databases until a name starts to emerge from the branches. It wasn't fast. It wasn't easy. The Bone Lake case joined a waiting list of dozens of other unidentified persons. Cases competing for the same limited lab resources and volunteer hours. Fundraising had to be secured. Lab time had to be scheduled. And even once the case was fully funded, the DNA itself kept fighting back. Sample after sample failed to yield enough genetic material to work with. Then, in the fall of 2025, a sample from the head, the original piece of evidence pulled out of Bone Lake in 1993, finally produced a usable genetic sequence. After 32 years, after 2 failed lab attempts, after a foot sample that had already sent the investigation back to square one once before, something in that skull still held enough of her DNA to talk. By February of 2026, That sequence had kicked off a full genetic genealogy investigation. Volunteers spent nearly 200 hours combing through DNA matches, building out family trees, narrowing down branch after branch of distant relatives until they landed on a specific family and a specific missing woman inside it. A woman whose age matched, whose disappearance matched the year the remains were found, whose family had never stopped looking for her, even after 3 decades of silence. Her name was Denise Elaine Sexton Hartley. Detectives traveled to Columbus, Ohio, to meet with her family in person. There, they collected a DNA sample from Denise's daughter, Nicole. That sample was compared against the genetic profile pulled from the skull recovered in Bone Lake in 1993. And on June 11, 2026, the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension confirmed the match. 33 years after a stranger mistook her head for a mannequin floating in a Minnesota lake, the Bone Lake Jane Doe finally had her name back. So who was Denise Hartley? She was 27 years old in 1993. She'd grown up in Ohio, and like a lot of people in their 20s, she'd had some brushes with the law in her younger years. Nothing that defined her, but enough that by the early 90s, she was looking for a fresh start. She found one in the Twin Cities. Denise moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, to live with her sisters, who were already settled there. She enrolled in college. She was, by every account investigators have gathered since, genuinely trying to rebuild her life. Her family knew she sometimes disappeared for short stretches of time. It wasn't out of character for her to go quiet for a few days here and there. So when she stopped being in contact in 1993, it didn't immediately set off alarms the way it might have for someone else. By the time her family realized something was seriously wrong, too much time had passed, and in one of the most devastating details of this entire case, no formal missing persons report was ever filed for Denise Hartley back in 1993. Which means that while investigators in Minnesota were canvassing Scandia, running bloodhounds along the shoreline, and circulating a sketch of an unidentified woman's face to 5 states worth of police departments, there was a family in Ohio who already knew she was gone. 2 halves of the same tragedy, separated by state lines that never found each other. Not for 33 years. But here's the part of this story that deserves to be said clearly. Denise's family never stopped looking. They kept her name and her photo circulating for decades, long after the trail seemed to have gone cold, long after most families would understandably have lost hope. They posted about her on social media for years, refusing to let her fade into a statistic. And when investigators finally traced a genetic match back to their family tree in early 2026, that persistence, 3 decades of refusing to give up, was part of what made the connection possible. For the detective who inherited this case in 2024, working it for 2 years, the identification was described as a profound sense of relief, mixed with the sober realization that the hardest part of the investigation was only just beginning. Because here is the twist that makes the Bone Lake case so unsettling even now. Denise Hartley has her name back. Her family finally has an answer to the question that haunted them for 33 years. Is she alive? Is she dead? Where did she go? But the question of what actually happened to her, who did this, why, and how a young woman's remains ended up scattered across 2 bodies of water 30 miles apart in the summer of 1993, remains completely unanswered. Her cause and manner of death are still officially unknown. No arrests have been made. No suspect has ever been named. For 3 decades, investigators were working a case with no name attached to the victim, which meant there was no way to build a timeline, no way to trace her final days, no way to figure out who she'd been with, who might have wanted to hurt her, or why. Now, for the first time since 1993, detectives finally have something to work with. A real person with a real history, real relationships, and a real timeline that can be reconstructed. Investigators are now retracing Denise's final months in 1993, piecing together who she associated with in St. Paul, when exactly she arrived from Ohio, and who might have seen her in the days before she disappeared. They're asking anyone who knew her, in Minnesota or back home in Ohio, even the smallest acquaintance, to come forward. Because in a case this cold, the smallest detail can be the one piece that finally moves it forward. It's a strange, almost paradoxical moment for this case to be in. After 33 years of nothing, no name, no leads, no family to interview, no starting point at all, investigators suddenly have a foundation to build on. But the clock has not stopped working against them. Every year that passes makes memories fainter, makes witnesses harder to find, makes the people who might know something less likely to still be around to tell it. Somewhere out there, someone knows what happened to Denise Hartley in June of 1993. Maybe they were young themselves back then, and maybe the passage of 33 years has changed how they think about what they saw or what they know. Maybe they've carried a piece of this story quietly for decades, never realizing that the woman found in 2 pieces in 2 Minnesota bodies of water finally has a name that could unlock everything. The Bone Lake case spent 33 years as one of the coldest, strangest unsolved mysteries in Minnesota history. A woman with no name, found in a way most people can barely process, in a town that never should have been touched by something so violent. And now, just weeks before this video was made, that mystery cracked open in a way almost nobody outside of Washington County, Minnesota, even knows about yet. She has her name back, Denise Elaine Sexton Hartley, a daughter, a sister, a woman who was trying to start over. What she still doesn't have is justice. If this case ever gets solved completely, if investigators ever find out exactly who did this to her and why, you can be sure we'll be the first to bring you that story here on this channel. If you found this case as unsettling and as unforgettable as we did, let us know in the comments. And if you want more forgotten, unsolved, and recently cracked cold cases like this one, make sure you're subscribed, because history like this doesn't stay buried forever.